All right, well, welcome to everyone who is just now joining us. Looks like we'll have a good group with us today. And so we are delighted to be able to offer you this very first webinar of the academic year. My name is Myles Werntz, Director of Baptist Studies at Abilene Christian University. And I'm here along with Dr. David Kneip, Associate Director of the Siburt Institute for Church Ministry. And we are delighted to have you with us today as we look at this question of forming communities of virtue. We are living through a real crisis of the moral life within churches. It's not that there's ever been an age without crisis, but we seem to be stuck in a time where there seems to be even a lack of a common moral grammar. Churches are stuck knowing that we should be good, that we have been called to be salt and light in the world, but there's a loss of clarity as to how we become good or what tools there are for understanding the moral life. And what's more, we seem to be even struggling to know how to talk charitably about these questions, given the different entities out there that want to claim our loyalty of morals.
That's right. And we think that's where virtue becomes such an important concept. Virtue is more than being moral or following rules. It's about becoming good and wise through cultivating a kind of character that is consistent with the fruits of the Spirit and with the Beatitudes and with the examples of Scripture. Virtue isn't simply adhering to a rule, but becoming wise so that we're able to live faithfully even when there is no rule in front of us. But then the question is, how do we become virtuous, right? Our panelists today, Karen Swallow-Prior of Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary and Richard Beck of Abilene Christian University, have each thought about this question, but through the lenses of their disciplines. Dr. Prior is Research Professor of English and Christianity and Culture at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. She's the author of books like Booked, Literature in the Soul of Me from T.S. Poetry Press in 2012, Fierce Convictions, The Extraordinary Life of Hannah More, Poet, Reformer, Abolitionist from Thomas Nelson in 2014, and most recently of On Reading Well, Finding the Good Life Through Great Books, a Brazos publication from 2018. Dr. Beck is a professor of psychology at Abilene Christian University. He is the author of books like Unclean in 2011, Stranger God in 2017, and most recently, Hunting Magic Eels, Recovering an Enchanted Faith in a Skeptical Age, just this year, among many other titles.
So we've invited them on today to reflect on the nature of virtue and how their disciplines can help Christians think about the good life and the kinds of things which deter Christians and congregations from living that kind of life. And so Richard and Karen, we'll begin with, I'll start with Karen. Talk to us a bit about the kind of work that you do and how you see your discipline helping Christians to understand the good life, as well as maybe what prevents us from living lives of virtue.
I love this question because, as was already mentioned, this is the subject of my most recent book. It is examining the classical and the Christian virtues through the lens of literature. And I spent a lot of time studying, researching, and writing that book. Yet, the way that I have approached literature as both an English professor and a reader myself for my whole life has really embodied, I think, this very idea of developing virtue through, in my case, the discipline of English. And so I go back really to the beginning of being a child and loving to read and just loving the world of books and the way that books could take me to places that I wouldn't go and to see the world through the eyes of people that weren't like me. And I spent my whole life reading and realized, even growing up in a Christian home, that I was learning things about life and about truth, capital T, truth, that I wasn't learning like in church or Sunday school, really. And it wasn't until I was actually in my PhD program that I realized that literature is this gift of God, who is the Word, a gift that uses words, and through these words, through stories, we can actually learn what kinds of mistakes we can make as human beings, how to avoid those mistakes, how to be wiser. And so my whole life has been just one of being immersed in books and learning about the world and human nature through stories. And so when I began teaching literature, that is just how I approached it. I approached it as an art form, which it is, but also an art form that helps us to find and make meaning and find our own purpose in life, because that's what happened for me personally. And I think that's what can happen to all of us when we engage with literature well.
So kind of what's interesting here is that both David and I both have backgrounds in literature. Both of us did kind of English undergrads. And so I resonate very much with kind of the thing that you're saying here, that literature kind of invites us into a world that's not our own and invites us to experience the lives of another and to learn from them. So in your most recent book, talk to us a bit about what you do in your most recent book about reading well and about how that is working for you.
Yeah, well, it's an odd book in the sense that it is about literature. It's about some of the works that I love and have learned a lot from, but it's also about virtue and virtue ethics. I am not a virtue ethicist or philosopher by training, and I'm an English professor, so I had to kind of dig in deep, starting with Aristotle and going through Aquinas, because we have this long tradition of what's called virtue ethics in both the secular world and the Christian world. And what I love about virtue ethics, and I know we're going to get more into this as we go along, is that as was implied in some of the opening remarks here, is that it really has to do with our purpose as human beings. I mean, what were we made for? And Christians have answers to this question, but also non-Christians have answers to those questions. And that's what brings virtue ethics together, is it says that our ultimate happiness as human beings is found in fulfilling our purpose. Now, of course, that begs the question, what is our purpose? And as Christians, of course, we have a particular answer, that we are made to glorify God and to find our meaning in doing that. And yet there are so many ways that we can do that. So when we look at the different virtues, which is what I do in On Reading Well, I take a work of literature and show how that particular work of literature embodies something about a particular virtue, whether it's courage or prudence or chastity or faith, hope, or love, all of these wonderful virtues, that if we understand what that virtue is and what it's not, because we have a lot of false versions of those virtues around, that can actually help us practice, as Aristotle said, because he said that virtue is something that becomes by practice a habit to the point that it's second nature. We can become virtuous people, whether, we can become courageous, we can become patient, we can become temperate, all of these things through practice, because they are not natural to us fallen human beings. And so literature is one way that we can sort of vicariously practice these virtues by thinking about them and testing them, as the scriptures tell us to test what is good and flee from what is evil. Literature allows us to do that. And that's kind of what I do in this book.
David, did you have a question that you wanted to? I have a follow up to that. I think this is curious to me. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, I don't know if it's so much a question, but a comment. When you were talking about the idea of practicing, that's definitely my experience as a reader of stories. Is I find myself getting into the story, and maybe I'm not thinking explicitly, what would I do in that situation? But because I experience the consequences, whether positive or negative, I'm learning from those characters. That's one of the things I appreciated about the way you started out that book also is, that's not that every story has a moral to it, but right. We draw morals from the story. And I think it is about that experiencing the life along with the characters.
And in fact, as I would say, and this is sort of, for some people, this might be a new idea, that the less explicit the moral is in the story, the more we're actually practicing morality, because we're forced to kind of go along on that journey. Even as you said, if we're not consciously thinking about it, we're actually still practicing it.
We're forced to empathize with that character to kind of get into their shoes, to understand their motives a bit more, to kind of sympathize with their circumstance, and then ask, what would I do in this given situation? Would I respond in the same way that Lizzie does? Do I take a different road entirely? That's good. I'm going to ask one quick question, and then I want to draw Richard in here. In what ways do you find this happening as you think about congregational life? Like, what possibilities do you see for literature kind of finding a home in the way that we do church or church practices? Where do you see that connection?
Wow, that is such a good question. If we were having this conversation 2 years ago, I probably would have gone in a completely different direction. But since we're having it today, I think what I want to say that is most pressing and important is that, I think we all know we are living in extremely polarized and divided times, even in the church, unfortunately. And so I think this practice of empathizing and understanding and walking through someone else's experiences and point of view, even if we don't agree with that, or it's very different from our experience and point of view, that is what we need in order as the body of Christ to listen to one another, to understand one another, to hold back, before we offer our opinion or judgment, and to just walk through things with people. That's the practice we are lacking right now in our culture and in our churches, and that's what I think literature offers us the most of that we need right now.
Offers us an opportunity to get better at it, to practice practice these things. Yes, absolutely. Richard, talk to us a bit about the work that you've been doing and how you see your discipline of psychology helping Christians to understand the good life and virtue, as well as maybe what keeps us from embracing that more fully.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I got really interested in virtue after the publication of my first book, Unclean, because Unclean it's kind of a book that presents a kind of a radical, I would even say kind of transgressive call to hospitality, to cross boundaries, to embrace the unclean, to kind of follow Jesus into those spaces we might not be led to go. And so churches started inviting me to come and talk about like radical hospitality. So I'd show up for a weekend at a church and kind of talk about social psychology, embracing of the other, crossing over to that other part of the town where your church doesn't spend a lot of time. And in all those conversations, I kind of ran into what I'll just call like the imagination to capacity gap, which for this conversation, we can call the imagination to virtue gap, that's easy to articulate from a pulpit or hear in a podcast, a really compelling vision of hospitality or even radical hospitality. But then after you kind of articulate that, you just kind of see a failure of response in the church. And so I began to notice that churches lack certain social, relational, psychological, moral capacities to do what we're asking them to do. Because what Karen said, right, we aren't the beautiful people sometimes we think we're wired to have triggers. We come in with prejudices and inclinations relationally that get in our way. So I realized that before you can get to the missional moment, you're going to have to do some prior spiritual formation work to form a people who can engage in these practices that might be difficult for us to do. And so that became a journey to kind of dig a little bit deeper into the psychology of like spiritual formation and how we need that prior work before we can kind of get on with the relational work. The other thing I'd add here is that when I then went into the spiritual formation literature, there's actually not a lot out there on the horizontal aspects. A lot of spiritual formation literature is still very much about the transcendent relationship with God. So, I mean, churches have probably gone through a series on spiritual formation, and they've talked about fasting, and they've talked about prayer, they've talked about silence and solitude and Sabbath keeping and all of those things. That still wasn't, in my estimation, as a psychologist, like moving the relational needle. You're still kind of working on this invisible relationship. And so a lot of my work was searching for spiritual formation, virtue forming practices that were socially oriented and that brought us into contact with maybe people we would not normally approach.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I what you're saying about the work that churches need to do to get ready is making me think. You're not primarily a developmental psychologist, but you have raised children, and we know that children don't come out of the womb virtuous, and we have to work with them as they develop. Are there maybe insights or things that you think developmental psychology might be able to help us with? Maybe if nothing else, patience as we watch children grow, as we watch Christians grow and churches grow, as we move toward that life of virtue, both individually and communally?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think one of the practical things that I've focused on is psychologists talk about what's called a dual processing model of the brain, and the system one, it's called system one and system two. System one is kind of our rapid, automatic, unconscious, and largely emotional takes about life. And then there's this system two, which is slower, more thoughtful, more deliberative. And I think by and large, a lot of parenting and a lot of spiritual formation efforts have chronically treated virtue formation as a system two problem that we can educate ourselves out of it. But as I talked to churches, I said, does anybody need a refresher on the parable of the Good Samaritan? And they don't. They know it in a system two kind of way. The issue is being able to, in a moment, be able to respond instinctively and automatically. And so the idea, so I kind of talk about virtue formation as like learning to play an instrument. It takes a lot of practice, and we've already mentioned that, to where that, and in that practicing is a system two issue. You go to a lesson, you practice, you move your fingers to play the chords, but eventually over time that becomes a system one. So to me, virtue is fundamentally, an issue of what's called automaticity, the degree to which I am able to act not based on conscious decisions and rules, but I form myself in such a way that my automatic behavior is Christ-like or virtuous. And I think that's the thing that parents, and so obviously, yeah, you need patience for that. One needs to practice their way into a certain kind of virtue and not just hear a good sermon and think that somehow it's going to change my automatic system one responses to difficult to love people. And here's the thing, I think, like, even the most liberal and progressive voices in the world need to hear that message. Like, I drive up on people all the time, and you see on the bumper sticker, it says, like, be a kind human being. Well, would that it were so easy to be a kind human being? Because the one thing that's obvious in this polarized climate is kindness is still pretty tribal, where it's easy to be very kind to people in my tribe. And so there is this hard transgressive thing to be kind to that person who disagrees with you about masks or a person who disagrees with you about vaccines. Mm-hmm. That's why I call it transgressive kindness, because there's some friction there that causes me not to want to lean in. And so that's going to take a while to practice your way out of that automatic response.
Richard, you've done a lot of work in your career on the concept of disgust and the ways in which we kind of automatically have kind of reactions to things that we perceive to be like naturally impure. So kind of one of the examples that you've used in your work is kind of the example of you have this cup of water, but then there's something about saliva associated with the water that makes us not want to touch that water at all. Even though, like, chemically there may be nothing wrong with it, it doesn't make it like any less drinkable, but somehow like we have this strong aversion to it. Can you talk to us a bit about like how does that play into our ability to be formed morally? How do we kind of get past kind of these moments where we feel like intuitively averse to something that may or may not be something that is dangerous or something that we need to be averse to? How do we move beyond that?
I think the top shelf observation is that human beings, and this is cross culturally, tend to have a default tendency to reason about morality in the idiom of contamination and dirt. You see this across cultures, and what happens is that when we reason about moral infractions in the idiom of contamination, it brings in a psychological response that's related to what's called disgust psychology, contamination psychology. I think the important thing to hear there is that's an emotional response. And we can have emotional responses, like I said before, that are very quick and automatic. And even though if we were more thoughtful and more deliberative, we would know that those emotions are actually leading us away from proper response. So for example, I did this on a stage yesterday with some of our freshman students where I poured like lemonade in a bedpan. This is a classic discuss demo. I poured lemonade in a bedpan and asked if a student would drink it. And they won't. And the point there is system 2, your rational mind knows that that's just lemonade and it's just a bedpan. System 1, though, the gut response has an aversive disgust reaction towards it. And that's what wins in the fight. And the point I was making for students is like, you're off to go back to hospitality. You're told by your parents, and David, you brought parenting, right? Don't judge a book by its cover, kids. It's easy to say that, but we judge by appearances. System 1 is evolved to be a quick, fast trigger to keep us safe, to keep us with our tribe and our people. And so unless you go through a long spiritual formation training, some of those wirings are going to just sit there idling. And then we ask our churches, why aren't you more hospitable to difference? And the answer is because we haven't done any sort of work or training to teach people to kind of rewire their hearts in such a way where their instinctive response toward difference is leaning in rather than leaning away.
So that makes me think of something if I can, I want to maybe put to both of you. Richard, I don't know if you used the word, but what you were saying connoted to me images of fear, right? That system 1 helps us when we are afraid, helps keep us safe. And it seems to me that both in the world of literature, where we get to vicariously experience fear with characters and watch them and experience that with them, and in psychology, which can help us understand fear, that there may be some tools there. I'm curious, how do y'all see fear operative in some of these moral challenges? Are there ways that fear can help us as we become more virtuous, or is that something that's more inimical, where fear turns us away from God and from being people of virtue? And feel free to take that in whichever order you'd prefer.
I'll let Karen speak.
I'm just here taking notes on everything you're saying, Richard. It's so interesting. I love this cross-disciplinary conversation. This again goes back, this idea goes back to Aristotle in Poetics, who talked about, he used the word catharsis, didn't define it very well, but there's a lot of people came after him trying to define it. The cathartic element of a well-constructed work of literature. He was talking specifically about tragedy. But part of what he talks about, there's this balance between, he talked about fear and pity. And I.A. Richards, a 20th century critic, kind of fleshed those out and said, fear is the instinct to retreat, and pity is the instinct to embrace. And if those are in perfect balance, then that's an example of virtue, because, and this is something that I meant to get to earlier, is kind of just defining what virtue is. And virtue is, at least according to Aristotle, and everyone who is right agrees with Aristotle on this, virtue is moderation. Virtue is the moderation between an excess and a deficiency. So if we have too much of something, of any good thing, that's a vice, just as it is if we have too little of it. And so this balance of just to go back to Richard's example of disgust, or the balance, disgust and our visceral disgust and our rational mind, it's not that we want to eliminate one or the other. We need both, just as we need system 1 thinking and system 2 thinking, because we are embodied creatures and we are also intellectual creatures, and we can look throughout history and of philosophy and literature and psychology and see tendencies to embrace one at the expense of the other, like Descartes, I think therefore I am, versus Augustine, who knows that that we are creatures of loves and desires first. And so I think just simply, and now I've lost track of the question, bear with me, but this balance that we need in understanding our human condition, which is visceral and also intellectual, is emotional and also rational. That's what we're exercising when we read good literature, because it's an emotional, aesthetic experience and also an intellectual one. And that's why I think literature is so powerful in the area of virtue ethics, because I do love all art. I love music and I love painting and sculpture and all those things. But literature is that art that combines both. It uses words, which is associated with the logos, with rational thinking, but it also, and again, I'm talking about literary fiction, not just pulp fiction or, murder mystery, and those are fine. But literature also provides an aesthetic experience as well as an intellectual one. And since I lost track of the question, I'll just stop there.
Yeah, the other thing I'd add there is literature is also like an aesthetic and emotional journey, right? Literature is a journey of spiritual formation intellectually, but also aesthetically and empathically. And so, when I think of fear, David, in my, I think John saying, perfect love casts out fear. And so it's interesting that love is not pitted against hate, it's pitted against anxiety. And we're living in a really anxious age right now. And how fear tends to be the thing that undermines virtue. In my book, The Slavery of Death, I kind of put anxiety at the root of all of our moral failures. This is kind of coming from the Eastern Orthodox tradition, that we, in a world of perceived or real scarcity as physical creatures, we're just inherently self-interested. And that causes us to draw a line between myself or the people I care about and everybody else. And we're living, I think, in a time, one of the reasons I think we're so polarized is we're living in a time where fear is being manipulated in pretty toxic ways. I once heard a speaker, I have no idea who it is right now, but they made this comment. They said, like, recessions are morally dangerous. And the idea there is that when things feel, the problem of scarcity, Brene Brown would call it the never enough problem. When I feel like I don't have enough safety or enough resources, job opportunities, then I become pretty tribal, and I want to go. And then, like, you're going to be worried about something like immigration. Like, hey, why are those people cutting in line? I paid my taxes, I paid my dues, I'm a citizen. And so I get worried about that. And then politicians step in to manipulate those fears for their own purposes. But to come back to the point of virtue is, you just can't look at a group of people and say, don't be fearful. Like, don't be anxious. It's like telling a depressed person to cheer up. You just can't say, everybody calm down. You have to practice habits and be in a culture where an imagination of generosity and an economy of abundance, right? God's economy of, that there is plenty here. That takes a while to get yourself to that spot. And so we need virtues that kind of can make us be brave in a culture of fear.
I want to ask one question quick before we have some Q&A lining up here, which I think will be really good. Mm-hmm. As you survey kind of the broader church world, what are the things about which you think we need a better conversation that involves virtue? What are those kind of dividing questions? What are those perplexing conundrum which you think we need to invite virtue into that conversation as a really robust partner?
I would initially have said kindness, but that's a pretty popular message right now. So I'm going to say something maybe that might be a little bit different. I'm with kindness on this, but to me, a virtue that isn't talked about enough, but it's very biblical, is humility. And as positive psychologists have studied humility, some of the sub characteristics of humility are, number one, being able to tell the truth about yourself. And I think a lot of people are pointing fingers at other people. I think it's helpful to kind of bring a self-critical eye back, to admit your own and being willing to confess your own faults. A willingness to admit error is a part of a humble person. And then the last thing would be a willingness to learn from other people, to put yourself in the posture of a student. That humility has, I think, been lost. And consequently, we can't listen to each other because we don't think we can learn from anybody else. And we're also unwilling to admit our faults. So I'd kind of put humility out there as something I think we need to have a little bit more of, to go into a conversation kind of go like, hey, I don't have all the answers here. I'm not going to yell. I just want to listen and learn a little bit. That would be helpful, I think, in our civic discourse.
I think that requires a sense of a recognition of expertise in some ways, like that there's no need for you to be an expert about everything. It's okay that you don't have that answer and that you can defer to someone who does.
So, humility is definitely my favorite virtue, but since Richard took that, it's a really important one. It's actually, if pride is the cardinal sin, then its opposite, humility, is the most important virtue. But since we've been talking about fear, I'll choose courage, which I think also is a misunderstood virtue, because we tend to think of courage as just, you can't have too much of the ingredient of courage, which we might call boldness or guts or something like that. But actually, when we have an excess of courage, it's recklessness. And so courage is, there's the deficiency of courage is formulated in a common cliche of, courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting in the face of fear. That is a cliche, but it's also actually true. So virtuous courage has nothing to do with too much or too little fear, or too much or too little boldness. It's acting, taking the warranted risk without entailing harm or recklessness. And so, the common cliche that we hear today out there is, faith over fear. Well, faith and fear should never be pitted against one another, because courage actually has nothing to do with the absence or presence of fear. It has to do with taking the right risk in the right time for the right purposes, and not causing harm as a result, not being reckless. And so I think we have a misunderstanding of courage, and therefore we need real virtuous courage more than ever today.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's not hard for me at all to think of social media conversations where I see people doing things that I think they would characterize as courageous, which have in fact become relationally reckless in a variety of ways. I want to pull in a question from the Q&A. We've got some folks encouraging us to think practically, which is great. Here's one that says, it's easy for us to talk about virtue being good and important, and our church folks will likely nod their heads. How can we show them how good and meaningful and needed it is? What are some things that we can do that help expose our people to godly virtue in a way that draws them in, something that's attractive? What do you think about when you hear that question?
I'll start. One of the things that I think about, and I want to say this with humility, of course, in a virtuous way, but I think about some of the positive feedback I get from my interactions on social media, where I do strive intentionally to demonstrate what it means to be virtuous. I fail often, but I really do try to model virtue. And the feedback that I get suggests that people really don't know what that looks like. As you just said, David, people, think some bold, reckless act is courage, when it really isn't, if it's reckless. And so I do think that we have so few models of it, and so few engaging, especially in the public realm, that people do want and need to see it, and they recognize it sometimes. And so I think, again, I'm a teacher, so that means every need is a teaching opportunity. I do think that people respond to these things being modeled and demonstrated, and that's just a start.
Yeah, no, that makes sense to me. One thing I've wondered about, and Richard, I want to hear from you as well, is, to go into your discipline, Karen, just the power of stories there. I have long thought that, especially for Protestants, this is a place where the stories of the saints could be really, really valuable for us. That, some of the famous ones are the stories of self-renunciation, but goodness, there are so many stories of saints, both canonized and popular and otherwise, that exhibit virtue and can show us, what it looks like to follow Jesus in particular cultures. And I might have to do a little transcultural work there, but if I see someone living in a world that maybe is a little more like mine than that of the first century in Palestine, maybe that helps me think about what virtue can look like in my own life.
I think this is a pretty scriptural impulse, right? I mean, Hebrews 11 is nothing but kind of recounting the stories of the virtuous, of the saints of the past. And all the Old Testament and New Testament narratives where we have stories displayed, some of which we're supposed to emulate and some of which we should absolutely not emulate. Mm-hmm. So, I think it's a good.
Yeah, I remember the first time I read the Brothers Karamazov and just being absolutely captivated by Alyosha's, the way he moved through the world. Like, so Ivan is this atheist brother and he has all the best arguments. But if you had to pick a model for moving through a suffering, broken world, you don't pick Ivan. You go with Alyosha and the way so he is this amazing model of gentleness and kindness. And he's trying to take care of everybody, his brothers, his father, the kids in the town. It's just, so I think literature is an amazing, or to me, I think a shattering experience was watching Reading Les Mis and seeing Jean Valjean just try to, care for all the people in his life, anyway. So I think, yeah, amen on the literature thing. I think that another thing I would say from psychology is this might be a little weird one, but I know it's really hard for Protestants to kind of lift up moral exemplars from among themselves, and I think maybe this is a part of our issue with pride or whatever. But one of the things you constantly hear in the spiritual formation literature is we need apprenticing models. And everybody nods their heads in their seminaries and go, yes, we need to apprentice. We need to learn the way of Jesus from somebody else. But then if you go to churches, like they don't put masters out. Like we say we need to have apprentice models, but nobody points to the master plumbers or the master electricians of virtue. So we're recommending something that we are not doing ourselves. So you might, I know this might be weird, but I once had a student who was wanting to do research on wisdom. And one of the ways she did a research is had a nomination procedure in the church and just said, hey, when you think of wise people in your faith community, who comes to mind? And then she looked at all the nominations and these names rose to the top. That community knew these people to be wise. And you could do that for any virtue, the kind, the gentle. And then she went and had conversations with those people about, hey, like you're clearly, and that was a surprise to them that they got nominated, but you're clearly the wise one. Like, how do you live? Like what do you do through the day? I think there's resources we have in our own faith communities to not just lift up literature or the saints, but the people amongst us that are the gentle and the kind, and ask them and like, what's it like for you when you read Facebook? Are you even on Facebook? Like what are their habits? And learn from them.
So we've got a good question that's come in here. What would y'all recommend as the most basic and essential, like virtue 101 kinds of practices for facing fear and acquiring virtue, both individually and as communities? Like what are those sorts of practices?
Karen, you got something?
That's such a good question. Of course, fear is so big and we all fear different things. So I guess I would say, for each person, maybe we need to ask, what is it that we fear the most? Which is a hard question, and we don't have to blab it on Facebook either. But just ask ourselves that, and then look for ways that we can practice stemming and disciplining that fear. And those could be, it doesn't even have to be the deepest, most devastating fear that we have. It could be one that's more superficial. We all have a lot of fears. This is such a good question, and I do think it's a really good one to ask ourselves, and then maybe just select one and practice facing that in ourselves and in with our loved ones. It could be something like I fear. I'll just use an example from my own life right now that has to do with the pandemic, and how very, very overly cautious I am about it all. And it has to do with my own, my elderly parents live with us. And so I think to myself, I could not live with myself if I brought something home to them. And so I think about that fear and think, okay, well, I have to have some limits to that fear. I can't let that, that fear go, I can't let it be unmitigated by other balancing virtues. And so that's just a practice that I can have and think, okay, so I'm being this cautious for this reason, but how much do I need to temper that with, not being reckless in other ways, not neglecting other responsibilities or the things that God has called me to. That's just sort of a simple example, because I wouldn't call that one of my deepest, darkest fears because I wouldn't share that here on this podcast.
Yeah, just to follow up on what Karen said, like being specific and picking one thing. And so let me back up and just kind of say, to me, this is my simple 101 for any virtue. It could be kindness, it could be patience, it can be fear. It's kind of what I discovered after that season on Unclean, when I went looking for spiritual formation practices that helped us relationally. And I landed on the Little Way of Therese of Lisieux as kind of an example of spiritual formation about approaching people. But what her Little Way is an example of, and Karen was pointing to it as well, is what psychologists would call an implementation intention. So this is like, if I was going to be practical with the church, an implementation intention is kind of a behavioral rule that, like, when X, do Y. When X, do Y. X is a situation, a context where you're encountering that kindness trigger or the impatience trigger or my anxiety trigger. So you identify that when, and then you pick a response that moves you towards your goal. So, like, in the practice of the Little Way, one of the things that Therese did is whenever she was in a space, she would kind of look around the room and move towards the people that seemed lonely or left out. That was just her. When I get into a new social situation, I don't move to the same and the similar. I move to the margins. And she just practiced her way into this habit. And I think, like Karen has given as an example, is like whenever you're in a situation that's triggering some anxiety, or you're going to be stepping into a space that you're going to need some courage to have an action that you're going to do. That could be taking a breath. It could be a prayer that you say, but that moves you towards your virtue. And then once you have that implementation intention, and this is scientific, like meta-analyses have shown that these intentions move the needle on the virtue. So you're not instinctively courageous. You're not instinctively kind, but you have a plan. Otherwise, if you don't have the implementation intention, you just wander through life triggered. You just wander in a situation, you find yourself anxious or upset or leaning away. And then at the end of the day, you go like, why wasn't I a better person? And the answer is you didn't go with any strategies or any thoughts ahead of it. So it can be pretty simple, the behavioral technology, but it takes a degree of intentionality to do that.
I have one other sort of simple example, if we have time for that. It's just, I would say one of my greatest vices is impatience. And so I moved from, one area of the country where everyone's in a hurry and they go fast, even just walking fast and talking fast, to another area of the country where it's the opposite. So my patience got very tried over the years. But one place where I found myself being extremely impatient all the time is in like the grocery store line, with the people in front of me, with the clerk, with the baggers, everyone very impatient. And so I just made it a practice over the years to be patient and to be kind. And the more my patience was being tried, the kinder I wanted to be to the clerk, to the people in front of me, to the baggers. And now I do think that now I feel very kind when I'm in that situation, because I did try intentionally to develop patience in place of my impatience.
One of the things, Richard, your example of Teresa of Lisieux, I think one of the things that makes her example so powerful is that after her death, she was named one of the doctors of the church, which is an honor which has only been given 33 times. So you're there, and Teresa, she dies very young. She leaves behind very little writing of any kind. And so she, in her virtue, is named as kind of one of the exemplars of the faith, alongside kind of more, say, folks that are known for kind of their towering intellect, someone like a Thomas Aquinas. Mm-hmm. So that this emphasis on virtue becomes really central to, like, this is what the Christian faith is significant. Like, this is what we hold up as being the most important thing to do.
Yeah, I think Thomas Merton said, Therese had, her secret was what he called the democratization of holiness. Mm-hmm. And what he meant by that was that prior to her work, right, virtue, extraordinary virtue, heroic virtue was for the elite, the saints that get canonized. But she had figured out a way through these practices of just being kind and patient, of importing into just any life, into the small domestic spaces of a life, from being a parent to a friend to a caregiver to a coworker, that we all can be working on these to a point, like you were saying, Myles, like to like a heroic level of, she's honored as a saint now and a doctor of the church, and so. A lot of us, I think, sometimes when we think about the call of Jesus, think that was like the heroic journey was like a young person's game. Like when we were young and we weren't married, we didn't have a mortgage, that maybe we'd go to some foreign mission field and do something big. But I love the little way, because this heroic calling, and to go back to what you're saying, David, to like be patient with a child, if you've ever tried that, that's pretty heroic. like you were in the trenches there, and getting along with a weird coworker or triggering social media feed. I mean, we are all dealing with like big moral stuff right now in the small spaces of our lives.
I want to shift our conversation just a bit. This has been wonderful. I have a question that wants to frame this discussion of virtue, but wants to frame it in perhaps one of the most fraught areas that constitute most of our lives, and that is online, like our digital lives. So as some research has begun to indicate, that when we go online, this literally begins to reshape our cognitive skills. It reshapes kind of our brain chemistry. It reshapes so much of what we are physiologically in our neurons. How do you think about, like, when you think about like digital life or our lives online, like what are the things that we need to be attuned to with respect to living these lives of virtue?
I was trying to make space for Karen again, but I'll hop in and say, one, I would say unplug a little bit more, but that's just because, and one of the reasons is, I think a lot of people have probably seen the documentary, The Social Dilemma, and the way the algorithms out there are kind of tracking with our clicks. And to connect that back with the conversation about fear, one of the things we know is that we click on things that cause us anxiety. And there's an AI engine out there that is keeping us anxious and engaged. It's the same formula for success that cable news has perfected, to where the world's falling apart because of this thing that's happening. And so we can't step out in a healthy rhythm to where we regain ourselves. And so we're constantly getting stressed by that constant stimulus. So I would say unplugging a little bit more. And the other thing, my wife she's pretty amazing at this. She calls it the ministry. And she's a person that has just devoted herself to using her Facebook feed to just promote positivity. She just puts her feed full. And And there are people who come up to her all the time and say, your Facebook feed is the most life-giving thing of my day, because I know that you're going to put in front of me something that's going to lift me up. And so she's very intentional in not getting drug in to the triggers, but is very dutiful in tagging and following things that kind of promotes life. And so if you're going to be on social media, I think there are ways and practices you can do it in a life-giving way.
Karen, I was reminded when thinking about this question about the work of Naomi Wolf, who has been warning for years that the ways in which we engage digital life actually diminish our ability to read, and thus our ability to have empathy. Because when we can't read well, we kind of lose our ability to have empathy with the characters in the book, because we're skimming, we don't pay attention, we're just conditioned to going too quickly through reading, these sorts of things. So what are your thoughts kind of when you think about the decline of reading culturally or the rise of kind of online life? What goes through your head?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way you introduced that last question about just what happens to us on digital media and being aware of that is half of the battle. And I hope everyone is at that point where we do know that it is changing our brains, it's changing our stress levels. It is changing us just the way, in a parallel way that the onset of print culture in the 17th century changed us and changed the way we think and communicate. Now, I happen to think it changed us in a good way, a better way than digital media, but it still changed it. It changed our culture. I highly recommend. I mean, it's an old classic now, but I think it radically changed my life and my thinking when I first read it, and it's still relevant today. And that's Neil Postman's "Amusing Ourselves to Death," where he's talking about the change from print culture to what was at his time in the 1980s, television culture or show business culture. Now it's that times 100, and so our ability to read and to read well is changing. But that's another thing that we can practice even in digital media, is understanding that everything is decontextualized there, especially on Twitter and Instagram, which are either very short form or image driven. And so we need to constantly ask ourselves and discipline ourselves and develop the practice to provide the context, even if it means the context that there's a human being behind this, this short blurb that has triggered something in us. If we can be mindful and intentional about that alone, I think that's powerful. There's a great story that I refer to often now I think it's the comedian Sarah Silverman. I hope I'm not misremembering this, but where, somebody called her a horrible name on Twitter, and rather than responding the way most of us would want to respond, she recognized the pain and hurt behind that person, reached out to him, and it became a long story involving a veteran who was experiencing pain and addiction, and she helped him. Our stories don't have to be that dramatic to just simply recognize the humanity by someone who might be lashing out and triggering us in a way. It's an opportunity really to practice all of the virtues that we've been talking about today.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And what you're describing with both of you, the location of much of the challenge in online interaction ties in with something that Christians have been talking about certainly in recent decades, both the possibilities but also the dangers of mass media. And formerly it was certain kinds of music or television or movies. One of our participants says, we've been talking about the pedagogical uses of things like literature and the capacity of art and literature to give us an aesthetic and emotional experience that can shape our capacity to behave virtuously. So there's both potential for good and for ill. And they're asking, in light of all that and in the world we live in, how should we be with the media we consume? Should we be careful? And if so, how? Are there features that you can identify of media that you would say are worthwhile and good and virtue building? It might be easier for us to identify negative things we want to avoid than positive things we want to pursue.
Well, I actually want to start with the positive, and that is social media has really has given voice to the marginalized and oppressed, I think especially of abuse victims and survivors who were alone and thought their experiences were either normal or their own fault. And social media has allowed people like that to connect with one another and to empower one another, and that is very powerful and important. I think that's a great positive. At the same time, we still have to remember the broader context, and we still have to remember that that there's a distorting element to social media, the algorithms, but also just even the fact that, you know, this is a debatable thing to say, it's very controversial, but Twitter isn't real life. I mean, of the 12 people that I am closest to in my real life, I don't believe a single one of them is on Twitter. And yet we go to elections and conventions and meetings thinking that, you know, what we encounter on Twitter is representative of real life. And so we really have to constantly temper those perceptions. And again, that's a practice in virtue too.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty skeptical about social media, so I'm not on it. So I'm probably not the best person to ask. But I do feel like I need to be informed, and so I do subscribe to news feeds. I do want to know what's going on in the world. I don't want to be a complete Luddite where I'm just like, hey, what's happening? You know, why are people upset? So I do think it's to have like responsible moral action in the world, one needs to know what's going on. And so I do think at least a minimal connection to know it. Now, whether or not you need to engage all the commentary about what's going on, that's a different thing. And so trying to kind of just track with a wide variety of news filters, that's kind of my minimal investment with some of that. And then I follow some people online in a select kind of curated way. I think the thing I would say though, and this is not about media usage, but it's a temptation of media usage that I think people should attend to, is the trouble with, I think, social media and being like hyper online, very online, is it cultivates a kind of a global and a national imagination. And so something that happens on the far side of the world becomes my problem today in my neck of the woods. And that's good. That's a good thing. It can also be, I think, a bad thing because we're always kind of preoccupied by the big narrative of the day, and we're not paying attention to our neighbors on the street. So the thing I would always ask people to do is don't lose track of what's your local news and your neighbor and local ministries, because unless your life is cashing out in your local context, then you're just emotionally reacting to the thing that is trending currently, important things, vital things, but things that don't engage you beyond a sympathetic stress reaction, rather than like flesh and blood on the street doing good work alongside my neighbors. And so make sure whatever you're consuming online finds a local expression. That would be my encouragement.
That's great. Well, I think we might have time for maybe just one more quick question. We're running up against that 2 o'clock hour, and I want to honor everyone's time. Okay, so we've talked a bit about kind of just different exemplars. Real quick, Karen, this is probably going to be the hardest one for you because you have a lot more to draw on here. If you were to pick like one literary, cultural kind of exemplar to point to and say, learn virtue from this character, who you got? Who's your go-to?
Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice. Austen was a virtue ethicist, and her works are about virtue. I've written a lot about that. I won't expand on it here, but that's my first choice.
Okay. Richard, what do you think?
The one character?
One character. You have one suggestion to make to someone to say, learn virtue from this person. Who do you go to?
Well, first of all, as a Jane Austen fan, I'm just saying, Karen, well done. But me, Sam in The Lord of the Rings.
Ooh, good. The virtues of friendship and endurance. Yeah.
Loyalty.
And loyalty. Yeah. That's great. Well, everyone, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful time. I've had a blast. I hope everyone else has too. To all of our participants, thank you for being here. Thank you for your great questions. And I hope that we've dropped in a variety of resources here. I hope you take advantage of these things. Please look for our next. We have another webinar coming up on September 29th with Eugene Cho and Jeremy Everett. We'll be talking about hunger and the ways in which congregations can help address hunger on a very practical way. So I'm very excited about that coming up. Richard, Karen, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful, wonderful time. So on behalf of the Baptist Studies Center and the Siburt Institute for Church Ministry, thank you for your time and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.